into my backyard, Rob.
How about we get started, folks? It looks like we're good to go Facebook Live. Appreciate that, Kristen, for letting us know. Welcome, everybody. We are in the third installment of our first month of the series, March on Milwaukee, a digital history series. We are obviously wanting to take part in the process by which we provide more and more opportunities for learning in the digital sphere. And we will continue these conversations monthly. Today, though, we've got some pretty awesome folks to help us further contextualize the open housing marches here in Milwaukee in the late 60s. In fact, we have the two scholars who really helped to situate, contextualize, and tell those stories and share those narratives of this really important upsurge in Milwaukee history and civil rights history. I don't know how we could do this. I want to unlock everybody's microphone because I really want to make sure that Erica Metcalfe, Patrick Jones, that they get a big round of applause. So I'm going to give them a round of applause. Welcome. You know, we've got Patrick Jones out of the University of Nebraska. Patrick, I believe you are from Cleveland, Ohio. Is that right?
Yeah, born in Baltimore and then grew up in Cleveland. Went to Madison for grad school.
Awesome, awesome. Welcome. We're glad to have you today, author of Selma of the North, Civil Rights Insurgency in Milwaukee. And then, of course, we have one of Milwaukee's own daughters here. We've got Erica Metcalfe, a Riverside grad, I believe a Marquette alumna as well. Is that correct?
No, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee.
I was definitely getting to that one. I knew that one for sure. I wasn't sure if you were an undergrad at Marquette or not. But welcome, Erica. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to have you because of not only your research, but your long-term awareness and experience of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's always a pleasure. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, folks, here's what we're going to do today. We've been working through a process by which we use images to help tell this story so that we can obviously give our young people who take part in these conversations the opportunity to play with some primary documents, but the images themselves help to tell the story. So we're gonna move forward in three chunks to help with the classroom experience. The first chunk of today, and I want to thank Keisha. Keisha's in the background running our PowerPoint for us, as well as Kristen and Heather, folks who've been a part of this, of developing this process for us. And Keisha, you can go to the next slide. The first chunk that we're going to do is look through some images. We're going to use some images to help instigate our conversation and initiate our conversation. We'll get our scholars talking about some of those images. Adam Carr is over there. Adam, oh, sorry about that, man. It is all about me, but I'll let you introduce yourself. Why don't you tell us who you are, big guy?
Just briefly, I do a variety of work around Milwaukee. I work behind the scenes at Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, do writing, film, photography, and probably the honor of my whole life has been working on the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches, which, much like the marches, is lasting much longer than we thought it would. We're into year 52, I think, and this is still a major part of my life. So happy to be here.
Well, thank you, man. I'm glad. It's always a pleasure to work with you. So Adam's gonna take control in just a second. He's gonna walk us through, and our panelists through this conversation around some of these very rich photos that help to tell the story. So that's gonna be our first 15 or so minutes. Our second chunking, our second 15 minutes, we are going to give our scholars the opportunity to talk a little bit about how they research and teach these important histories, just so that we get a chance to hear from them and learn a little bit about their craft. And then we'll open it up right away for Q&A in that third 15-minute chunk so that we can get folks in the conversation. However, we do not in any way expect for the 33 plus folks who've attended with us today to wait until that Q&A. This is the awesome part about doing these kinds of conversations. You can drop questions into the chat. You can give us a whole range of thoughts and comments along the way so that we can make this as engaging and dynamic of a conversation. We are also on Facebook, so feel free to do your thing on Facebook as well, folks, and we will move back and forth between the two and see if we can keep everybody's comments and questions in the mix. Just know there is about a 10-second lag on Facebook. So if we get to something a little bit later, that's just because of that timing. For the panelists, can you please make sure for your chat to change it to all panelists and all attendees if you want the attendees to hear from you in that way. They'll be giving us information, and so if you respond, just make sure that they can see your comments as well. All right, Adam, you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. First 15-minute chunk, let's look at some of these images and get our experts warmed up on this topic.
So these are some images that I know both of you have engaged with, have used actively. Wanted to start with a set of images that show the Youth Council, the Commandos, Father Grappi, and this image in particular highlights the cause that they marched around, the one that was kind of the spark that lit the fire here in Milwaukee, which is open housing, ending housing segregation. These are just some images, both shared with us from Dr. Metcalfe and Dr. Jones. These are just some of the images that we have, and I'm gonna just scroll through the first handful of these, and then we can go back and center on some. Actually, that's as far as we're gonna go for this first set. And let us just start with this image. Do you guys want to share a little bit of what you're seeing when you're looking at this image? I know it's one that's become kind of iconic.
Oh, well, for me, I think this is, one of the most powerful photos of the movement. We see the marchers holding up the American flag. You see Father Grappi is in there marching. I think it can be interpreted in a number of ways, this photo. I think you can interpret this photograph as, the marchers making a plea to their nation to say, it's time for the country to really live up to its democratic ideals and really embrace equity for everyone, not just some. But then on the other hand, I think you can kind of interpret it as patriotism to a certain extent, of them saying, you know what, we are Americans and we have the right to march and we're entitled to all the rights that come with being an American, and that includes access to decent and fair housing in this country. So yeah, to me, it's just always been an especially powerful photo because of the marchers holding up the American flag and all that that symbolizes.
To poorly paraphrase James Baldwin, one of the sort of quotes that we've kept in mind in our circle in Milwaukee through the course of the Open Housing Marches anniversary is as an American, he reserves the right to perpetually criticize America. As someone who loves it, that's part of his expression of love, is the ability to express critique.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that, seconding what Dr. Metcalfe said, and then also adding a couple of other things. So there's definitely a situating of this Northern movement within a broader freedom struggle, American freedom struggle and Black freedom struggle history. And when I started doing this work, first as a grad student and then after and finishing the book up, folks were not writing about struggles for racial justice during the movement era beyond the South. And so it was important to try to, and one of my main goals as a scholar is to insert those kinds of Northern civil rights and Black power stories, and to recast through that the national narrative and to assert that. In the popular kind of mythic sense of the Southern Black freedom movement, it is by some, at least today, a story that is told in kind of glorious terms of a movement that in a nation that ultimately acknowledged segregation and overcame it. That's a problematic narrative, but it's a kind of a triumphalist story, and it's embraced by many. And Northern movement stories hadn't been told. I'm gonna let my dog out here. But also, were often cast in problematic ways because of the way the story of Black power had been told. So I see in this too, a kind of recasting of Northern movement story within that circle of the best tradition of protest and struggle for justice and racial justice. I also note here the interesting place that opens up for us with Father Grappi, surrounded by a number of commandos and then others too, which allows us to begin to think about the peculiar place of this white Catholic priest who played an important public role in the movement there, and spurred much debate at the time and ongoing today. And then I would just say more broadly that my interest again is in trying to argue and assert the importance of the Northern movement and movements, and that they happen on a scale of the Southern campaigns and movements. So the open housing campaign in Milwaukee and white reaction to it, we're talking thousands of people coming out, is on a scale that's at least as big, if not bigger, than iconic moments that we have placed in the national narrative in the South, Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery. But the vast majority of people today still don't remember Milwaukee. It still has not taken its rightful place in the national narrative. And I feel strongly that it should. And so, why we have to ask that question, why don't we tell Northern movement stories? And what do we make of images like this when we don't really have a framework to make sense of them, right? They're compelling, but we don't really have a powerful, particularly in our schools often, framework to start to make sense of these really compelling and complicated, ultimately, images.
And Dr. Metcalfe, that point you're making there, Dr. Jones, I would love to further explore, both of you obviously, but yourself as a Milwaukee Public Schools graduate, myself as a MPS graduate, these aren't stories that we heard. These weren't every February. We probably should have gotten tired of hearing about the commandos and the youth council, but they went virtually, they fell into obscurity. So let's move on to some of these images that you guys shared a little bit. Let's stick with this one a little bit. You guys want to take a crack at what's going on here?
Well, in this photo, we see the youth council facing off with Milwaukee police. And I think this is another very powerful photo, and it's symbolic for a number of reasons. I mean, just observing the body language, you see the police and they're kind of on the defensive already. And meanwhile, the youth council is standing there unbothered, they're fearless. And that's probably because, they knew that the cause that they were fighting for was a righteous cause. But I think it's symbolic because it kind of shows us, or it's symbolic of the repression and the resistance that civil rights groups of that era faced. But on the other hand, it's also symbolic of the fearlessness and the bravery that these activists displayed in the face of that repression. So it's, as I said before, it's symbolic for various reasons. You can go beyond our local movement and find meaning in this photo.
Dr. Metcalfe, I really, this is my favorite image of all the many awesome images that help to chart this moment in civil rights and Milwaukee history. I love this image because of the tension that is present, particularly the tension in the open space. You can just see the funneling of the clash in the backdrop, and it's almost like it's headed forward toward us.
Yeah.
Image. As you mentioned, the stance of the youth council members in particular, the sort of fear and yet the bravery at the same time.
Yeah, I would this image in relationship to the previous image, right, I think is really interesting, where previous image, we have a kind of an image that fits within our tropes about the civil rights struggle. It's people marching, they're holding a flag, right, it kind of leads you to that, as we were talking about, images of patriotism, a claim on the nation for equality, etc. Here we have an image that suggests something very different about the open housing campaign, which is the standoff and what I would call massive resistance of whites to a pretty basic assertion of liberty and freedom by African Americans and their allies in Milwaukee. And we can see here helmeted police with nightsticks, and even towards the back, one already coming in to, perhaps level a blow. And it underscores a much more difficult dynamic of the open housing campaign in the Northern movement, which is this issue of massive resistance, which, Dr. King acknowledged the year before this in Chicago when he was there working on this issue and marching into white ethnic working class neighborhoods and faced great violence and was hit in the face with a brick that in all his time in the South, he had seen much reaction and violence, but never so much anger and violence as he saw in Chicago. So another dynamic of this is that we have to grapple not only with this history, but in terms of making sense of its ongoing legacy and the persistence of urban inequality today and racial injustice in a place like Milwaukee and other cities across the nation, with the breadth and depth and persistence of white resistance. And so we see it here in a very bald way with the police, but it took all kinds of forms, from people moving further out to the suburbs, from city councils and school boards using their power to resist even the most basic efforts at racial change, to new organizations being created, to the presence of the Klan and neo-Nazis, letter writing campaign, a whole breadth of what we could call massive resistance, I think, in the North. So I think that last image and this one are really interesting together in helping us kind of be careful and not placing the Milwaukee story within a kind of triumphalist, Pollyannish narrative of the civil rights movement, that it kind of acknowledged the problem and it overcame it and we're all better for it, but that this was a deeply difficult struggle, that these activists faced great peril, and that in really overcoming racial injustice in the society then or today, I mean, there's quite a mountain to overcome, and we have not done that yet, clearly.
Absolutely.
It's sometimes my role to sully the scholarly conversation that you all are having. We were talking about this in our pre-conversation. One thing that we've done in our efforts to get the folks in the community to see this as their story is we've handed people these images literally, physically, and said, make these into memes. Give us a caption. Make this come alive in your contemporary vernacular. We don't say that because that wouldn't.
Particularly with young people. Yeah.
Young people, absolutely. We've done this in the Vel Phillips Juvenile Detention Center. And this one led to one of my very favorite memes, which the young people wrote, "Nuck if you buck." Which they see it's about to go down, right? Like just in that one tight little phrase of contemporary understanding, "Nuck if you buck." Like, absolutely. Even if you don't know what "nuck if you buck" means, like,
you get it, right?
You get it, right?
Absolutely. Keisha in Command Central is telling us that we need to get ready to start moving to our second section, which will get us talking about your teaching and research process. But to help us move along that way, yeah, Adam, definitely keep showing us more images. I wanted to ask a question that I've been wanting to hear from both of you for years now around this. Part of what I like to do in the classroom with Milwaukee's civil rights history is talk about the open housing marches as this sort of rich blending of what we traditionally think about Southern civil rights activism with this rich and emerging sense of Black power radicalism. Like it comes together in Milwaukee in some very, very impressive ways. It kind of gives us a rich bridge from what would be that traditional civil rights, modern civil rights movement history into this much more radical Black power moment. What are your thoughts about that? Have I been wrong about that? I hope not.
No, I don't think you've been wrong about it. The Milwaukee movement was a very complex movement. It definitely blended, pieces of the Southern civil rights movement as well as the Black power movement. I mean, you had so much going on, you know what I mean? first of all, they did embrace Black Power. They would chant Black Power. Even Father Grappy would chant Black Power. He would encourage Black Power. That's what the commandos really were all about, creating some strong Black male leadership. But at the same time, it was church-based. It was based out of, but not based out of a Baptist church. It was based out of a Catholic church. So you have those Catholic elements in there. Their advisor was a white man. So it was integrated at the same time. And there were white youth council members and such. So it was definitely a very complex, diverse movement that blended all of those elements. I think you're exactly right in seeing the movement that way.
Well, and I got it from you too, so.
I mean, I think that's one of the most important and one of the most exciting dynamics of the Milwaukee history in particular, and Northern movement history more broadly, is that it really helps us, we have set this kind of popular narrative of the civil rights era, and it's regionally based, and it's kind of triumphalist, and it emphasizes integration, all these different ways, nonviolence. And the Milwaukee campaign kind of challenges all of those along the way in important ways, which are important about Milwaukee specifically, but they're just more important about how we understand the movement era broadly, even when we think about the South, where nonviolence took place alongside throughout armed self-defense. And for instance, it didn't all go down in churches or Baptist churches either. So there's, I think that problematizing of the way the popular story of the movement happens is really key in understanding what exactly went down and what kinds of lessons we should be taking from this history and how this can be a usable past to us. And it just opens fantastic ways for students in classrooms to think into that complexity about, these are not parallel lines like integration on one hand and Black Power on the other hand, that these things were intertwined together, and the very same people often at the same time articulated things we might call and put in the column of integrationism and also Black Power stuff, that these things were not separate and distinct, but tied together, and they were created by locality and changing and used by activists as they needed them in the moment as well. And I think that figure of Black Power or Father Grappy and Black Power and the Commandos and Youth Council is really an important one and rich as well, because we've got the Commandos who are men, and there's a real emphasis on raising up a new generation of Black men in leadership roles. But in the Youth Council, it's mainly young women, and there's this important place of young women in the Milwaukee movement too. And then you have Vel Phillips also, and her important and courageous institutional leadership, which then blends over as she comes down and marches too. So, there's gender stuff going on here, there's race stuff going on here, there's class stuff between middle class African Americans and more working class African Americans that are just blurring a lot of these lines. And then Father Grappy himself, I love to tell the story of when they went to Washington, and activists are trying to raise up the issue of housing nationally for a national law, and they invite Milwaukee to come, and Grappy and Commandos go, and they're confronted by a group of local Black Power advocates in Washington, D.C., and they call the Milwaukee Commandos out for being what they say is led by a white man. And Grappy doesn't respond himself. He kind of goes to the side of the room, and the Commandos, these young African-American men, step forward and articulate how they are Black Power and what Black Power means to them, that it is church-based, that it is an interracial movement there, but it's also militant, and they practice armed self-defense, meaning not with guns, but that they're willing to fight back with their fists, and that Grappy is legit because it's not about, as Dick Gregory is going to emphasize, the color of your skin, but about your consciousness and your willingness to be there with the struggle, and that Grappy had proven that and demonstrated that. So it's raising, Black Power is a debated issue at the time, and it continues to be. And the Milwaukee movement really raises these interesting questions about what is it, who can it be, who can be it, and in it, and what does it mean to have a militant movement in the urban North?
We've got a couple questions to these exact points. One of which one of our attendees wants to know, were there similar developments happening in Milwaukee such that, like in the South, folks would come from different parts of the country to take part? Do we have here in Milwaukee a similar kind of experience where folks from different parts of the country would come and take part in our movement?
Yeah, that's one of the notable things, and it's one of the things that connects to the Southern movement in some ways. Father Grappi and several members of the commandos and youth councils had gone south in support of earlier campaigns during Freedom Summer and voting rights campaigns, and most notably for Grappi, the Selma voting rights campaign, and had learned about kind of militant nonviolence and a confrontational nonviolence, and brought it back and tried to adapt that into a Northern context. And when they had those first few nights of marches and went across the viaduct and elicited such massive white reaction, like Dr. King had done in Selma, Father Grappi and others in the movement put out an ecumenical call, national call, to invite people of conscience to come to Milwaukee to participate in the campaign and to bear witness to what was happening. And hundreds of people did that. It tended to be more, those numbers were higher on weekends. They kept marching every day. So people would come in for weekends, and some would stay for several days at a time, and others for a few days. But yeah, so that's part of what got it national attention and national focus and made it a driving force and ultimately passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which I often refer to as the kind of the forgotten third Civil Rights Act of the movement era.
As you all have gone about your research, talk to us a little bit about your process. How did you get into this topic? Where did you go to uncover this story? Who did you talk to? If you can, we've got a number of educators who've joined us, and obviously there may be some students here too. Talk to us about your research process. Erica, you want to start with us?
Sure, I'll start. Just as me and Adam were talking about earlier, I was born and raised in Milwaukee, and I did not learn about the open housing marches until I was a 20-something-year-old graduate student. So I was very surprised that, this had happened. Even when I was a senior at Riverside, I had the pleasure of taking an African American history course. And we learned about the Southern movement, but we did not learn about the local movement at the time. I didn't even know that there had been a local movement. So once I got older, became a graduate student, I started learning more and more about the movement. I became very interested in the Milwaukee NAACP Youth Council and their various campaigns throughout the 1960s. I decided to write my thesis on the Milwaukee NAACP Youth Council, which you were on my committee, Robert. And so, of course, a big chunk, the thesis was from 1948 to 1968. And so a big part of their history, their biggest campaign, their most popular campaign, probably their longest campaign, is the open housing campaign. And so I actually dedicated a whole chapter to that particular campaign. And once I finished writing the thesis, it was important to me to not just sit on that research, but to publish it so that other people who were interested in this history, didn't know about this history like I had been, could have access to this history. So that's kind of how I got into,
Erica, if you wouldn't mind, I have right here, I have this right here. So here's the thing is we were so taken by the articles that you wrote. The Wisconsin Historical Society gave us their whole backlog of the issues they were published in. And then I gave away all of them and kept none for myself. So I had to print these off from the PDF. People were really wanting these things. And Erica, I just want to say this, and this other one that you wrote. So I printed off these pages, Commanding a Movement. When I read this article, I, like you, didn't know this story. I started meeting youth council members, talking to commandos. Someone shared this link with me. I read it. 3 pages in, I was both exhilarated and furious. Exhilarated because of how you did such an incredible job of unpacking that story. But I was furious because it was like, why don't I know this already?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I actually think telling people to read a PDF or a magazine article, like, if I can make everyone in Milwaukee do one thing, it would be reading that specific article. It can be a hard sell, but I just want to say to you, like, frankly, I would not be involved in this work if it weren't for commanding a movement, that article you wrote.
Wow.
So thank you for for giving me a space for these last 3 years to feel like so motivated to share this with other people.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And when I
That's
say
exactly what my goal was.
And when I say thank you, I also mean Rob and I have both been doing so much work on this. It's also like a thanks, Erica, for for lighting a fire that I'm still stoking and still a little like, man.
No, thank you guys for the work that you're doing.
You know, Patrick, your title, Selma of the North, it sort of looms in both its scholarly impact and punch, but then also as we look into our current highly politicized moment, our current racial geographies, it still sort of sits with us. How'd you come up with that title? How'd you get into this thing?
Yeah, well, when I was a grad student, was born in Baltimore and grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Similar contours of race, both on the positive side, the incredible history of African-American history in a place like Cleveland, first major city to have an African-American mayor. Langston Hughes publishes his first poems there, rich musical history, etc. But also the worst of race and inequality. So, I grew up, Tim Tyson, who's one of the great movement scholars, was my advisor at Wisconsin, and I was doing work on the Southern movement, but knew there were these Northern movement stories that weren't being told. Sociologists talked about them, and sometimes as when they talked about the ghetto and their language, but there really wasn't movement history being done on the North. So I wanted to do that because that's where I grew up, and I was initially going to do Cleveland. But I, like all of you, began to hear about the Milwaukee movement and the open housing campaign and the commandos and this curious figure of Father Grappi, et cetera, and was amazed that nobody had written about it and that nobody that was from there seemed to really know about it. I taught and I would teach, white students and black students at UW, and I would do a lesson always on this. And students would come to me sheepishly after class during my office hours or in the hallway and say, I'm from Milwaukee and I'm ashamed to say I didn't know anything about this. Or maybe they'd kind of vaguely heard this name, Father Grappi, and it held some attachment, like it was either negative or positive, but they didn't really know anything further about it. So, I didn't really have a model for work on the Northern movement. I had a lot of assumptions. So Milwaukee was available. One of the things that's great for teachers and students is there's just a rich array of materials that are available. They were in the Urban Archive and the Historical Society. Now they have largely been put online through the March on Milwaukee web project. So you can access those. And there's just an incredible amount of organizational records, personal records, flyers, leaflets, images that, each one is, a great tool for a teacher to open up various aspects of this conversation. So I started with a massive amount of just documents and archives. I went through daily newspapers, African American Press, Underground Press, the 2 different daily newspapers over more than a decade of time. And then I just began to meet people and do oral histories. And, those stories are enriching in such important ways beyond the existing historical record, the archival record. And there's more of that to be done, particularly with everyday people who participated. So I would encourage teachers and students, that's something you can keep doing with your students, is to have them do oral histories and to talk to their family, talk to their neighbors, and they don't have to be lengthy. I did lots of them with people like Vel Phillips and Lloyd Barbie. They were long, and many of them, but even 15, 20 minutes about how different kinds of people remember these events and if they participated or just how they perceived them, even if they weren't directly involved, and what they thought it meant for the community. This is really important and enriching. And the other thing I would say is for teaching is that there are lots of things still out there. Lots of people took pictures, lots of people kept things, and there's other archival stuff out there in people's possession that are not in the archives we have. So doing a kind of history harvest where you invite people to bring out things that they might still have could be a really wonderful opportunity for a teacher and students to engage this, and also to help continue to build the foundation of historical artifacts on this. I would say one challenge in this that I think is just really interesting that remains is this issue again of massive white resistance. What is like jaw-droppingly shocking when you tell these stories is the massive white response and the violence and the numbers, and people are like, holy moly, what the heck is going on? Why didn't I know this? And one of the challenges as a scholar or a teacher is that, you know, the civil rights organizations largely kept their records. The NAACP gave their boxes of stuff to the Historical Society, but most of the people, we have images, we have articles from the paper, pieces here and there. The letters that were written to Father Grappi and some other politicians are a really great insight into white reaction. But largely that's a challenge to get at, because the organizations, the closed housing organizations, they didn't keep their records and give them to the Historical Society. And when you go and try to talk to those people 50 years later, you know, and they were holding white power signs or a Nazi symbol or something like that, a lot of them don't want to like sit down and have an interview with you that you're recording to use in a book to tell you how and why they were involved with white reaction. And so a big challenge for us is how do we get access to understanding white racism and white reaction to this? How do we document it? And how do we learn from that? Because if we really want to untangle white supremacy and racism, we have to understand the material circumstances out of which those people's feelings and perceptions and things are happening. And if they didn't collect things and keep them and give them to the Historical Society or what have you, and they're not willing to do interviews with us, how can we get at that in new and creative ways? So that's a huge challenge on this kind of thing.
A few quick responses to that is I kind of, in my mind, I know those white power signs are in a garage somewhere in the western or southern suburbs. And one thing I think is that, you know, the racism was archived in the concrete of the highways, you know, in the concrete of the infrastructure that was built in Milwaukee in the subsequent 50 years. Another one, to an earlier point you made, a friend of mine just posted on Facebook, literally as we're talking, that he had two uncles who were part of the movement. And anytime he hears it mentioned, he's really proud. Rob and I have seen this over and over when we give these talks, is we get people come up to us afterwards, because we've done this all in all these different settings, saying, my aunt, my uncle, they'll shout out in the middle and say, hey, there's my dad, or something like that. So a lot of these folks are still around. And to that point, Patrick, after your talk at the Historical Society a couple years ago, I got to sit next to Mary Arms, who I've talked to before. And at the King and I, she told me some of my most treasured stories that I know about the open housing marches. And actually, because it wasn't a formal interview, like we were just kind of gabbing, and Mary kind of like whispered some things to me. I was like, Mary, that's incredible. And I don't know if she's told that to the historical record in the past. Like, so there's so many stories out there. That's one of the things I think is really motivating. I agree with you, for teachers and students, is that sometimes you can get in your classroom a marcher who will tell you stories that historians would die to know, you know?
Right. That's the good stuff. We're going to start moving toward some Q&A, just to make sure we keep our timing a little bit on track. But I want to also highlight that Kristen Leffelman from the Wisconsin Historical Society, she's dropping materials in the chat for us, folks. So you're getting some resources. Want to shout out the Wisconsin Historical Society one more time. And it's an awesome job collecting, preserving, and then disseminating and sharing this history. Want to shout the March on Milwaukee archives that Patrick mentioned earlier over UWM. You can find that online just by searching March on Milwaukee. It'll show up pretty easily there for you. So we've got some great institutions who are doing phenomenal work preserving our history and the rich history of this particular moment in the nation's civil rights saga. Let me throw a couple of questions out to us, and then we'll continue with audience Q&A. Couple of questions to start with. One, were there any gangs in Milwaukee involved in the local struggle, as we see in Chicago with the Black Keystone Rangers and whatnot? Were there any gang members who then became a part of civil rights activism here in the city? And then also, to what extent were there veterans from either World War II or Korea, or maybe even Vietnam, given that timing? Were there any veterans involved in the local struggle here? And I'll ask either of you, good doctors, to tackle either one of those two questions, whichever you prefer.
Oh, well, while doing my research, I didn't come across any information about any Milwaukee gangs that participated in the movement. I did come across information about Chicago gangs.
And were those Chicago gangs involved in Milwaukee?
They were involved to a certain extent, but primarily in terms of like criticism. The Blackstone Rangers were, had politicized themselves and were, getting involved in the movement. And so they will often come up to Milwaukee. But, in my research, I saw it as like they were coming to criticize them, not really to support the movement, but to say, what are you guys doing? You need to get more radical. You need to get more, embrace violence a little bit more. They received a lot of criticism for having a white advisor, Father Grappi. But what was even more inspiring was that, the youth council really held their own. They supported their movement. They were proud of their movement. They would tell them, no, we're not going to get violent. We are going to continue to have an integrated movement. So they really called the shots in their movement. They were not intimidated of those Chicago gangs at all. And so that's all I came across in my research. Maybe Rick has a different.
Yeah, I would just add that. So the commandos, when they first started to organize the commandos, a number of the original and early commandos were involved in kind of, gang might be too much of a word for some, but in kind of collections of young men who hung out together. Some of them, like Prentice McKinney, had a reputation. He got in fights a lot. He was in a kind of circle of people. And his nickname was Quick Fists because he got in a lot of fights and things like that.
It was Quick Fist. Quick Fist, the Retouchables. His crew were named the Retouchables.
Yeah. So that's a gang. I mean, it's a posse of young guys who were hanging out together, and then there were some that were in weightlifting groups. They would get together and in their driveway and garage and stuff. They would lift weights, and so there were circles of young men who were kind of hanging out together in the streets, doing different things that Father Grappi and the Youth Council purposefully set out to connect with and to try to shepherd into the movement some of that energy and frustration. And then they got some challenge from other gangs and other Black Power groups from other places. And they consistently stood forth, as Dr. Metcalfe said, in the face of those criticisms and articulated, what they were doing. And then veterans, the young man who came to the Youth Council and commandos initially with the issue of housing was a veteran, a Vietnam veteran who had come back and was trying to find housing in the city and couldn't, was facing discrimination. And that really was a powerful, particular example of the pervasive practice of housing discrimination against African Americans. And it had the extra punch, I think, of the fact that this was a young guy who had gone to Vietnam, had served, and had come back and wanted to kind of resume, quote unquote, the American dream kind of life, get a house, start a family, etc. And was having trouble doing that. And that animated Father Grappi and the Youth Council and Commandos to really focus on the issue of housing. And so that was an important part of it. And there are folks, I'm pretty sure, like Joe McLean, he's an older commando that, and I'd have to check it on that, but I think he was a vet. So there are folks, and then lots of people's parents and grandparents in the Black community had participated in Korea and World War II, and
Right.
Service was really key. That was key in Vel Phillips' story with her husband Dale, and coming back and not being able to, they faced housing discrimination both at UW Madison and in Milwaukee, and from other vets too, and so that generation who had served kind of in the previous wave of service was really important to civil rights activism and to a consciousness of being willing to challenge the urban northern system of white supremacy.
Yeah, it's all there. All the threads are right here in the city. It's really powerful. But we need to back up a little bit. We've got a couple of questions from our attendees that I think are important for setting context. One, let's just talk about what we mean by open housing. And then in the process of talking about that, if you all can give us just a little bit of the demographic information to help us understand the emergence of the African-American community and communities here in Milwaukee post-World War II. Can you give us some sense of how the population begins to explode in the 1950s and 60s here? And then also just give us some talking points, some precision around what we mean by open housing, which, as we talk about it, we kind of know, but folks might need just something to work with there. So give us a little bit of the context, post-World War II, Black community growth, and then what we mean by open housing.
So from my research, there was a small stream of African Americans migrating into the city during World War I and the post-World War I era, but those African Americans tended to be, I would say, maybe among the elite, the Black elite. And because the population or the amount of African Americans arriving was so small, they could kind of spread out a little bit more. There wasn't much segregation, I would say, or at least rigid segregation. But World War II came and a lot of industry in Milwaukee opened up to African Americans, particularly after FDR signed on executive order. I can't remember the number, but the one that, would punish different industries for discriminating against people of color in terms of employment. So once that happens, you kind of have, that Great Migration begins to intensify. We have more African Americans migrating to the north. Many migrate to Milwaukee, but to a lesser extent than, other places like Detroit, Chicago, and such. So as that migration intensifies, you have segregation intensifying in the city, housing segregation intensifies in the city. And so gradually we find the African American community in Milwaukee kind of just confined to this small area that becomes known as the inner core. And it became very difficult for African Americans, even those that had the means, to go beyond that inner core. So when we talk about open housing, we are talking about trying to end those limitations on housing back then in terms of like racially restrictive housing covenants where people could, do not sell to people of color, do not sell to African Americans. There were also, discriminatory federal housing policies as well. And so, back then during the 1960s, you would have actually landlords would say to them if they would try to rent a house or apartment or somewhere outside of the inner core area because it was just too overcrowded, a landlord might say, hey, I can't rent to you. I can't rent to your kind. What would the neighbors think? And that's what happened, I believe, with that veteran that Patrick was talking about. And he went to the youth council and told them what happened. And that's when they decided to join forces with Vel Phillips in this quest for open housing, fair housing, so that, African Americans could go out beyond that inner core. So.
Yeah, I would stress that Milwaukee is both the same pattern that we see in every large and middle-sized American city during this period in terms of the patterns of racial segregation and then the deterioration of circumstance within those segregated communities. So it's not just that Black people are limited to certain places, but that then with neglect and other kinds of discrimination, employment discrimination and systematic impoverishment, inequality in schools, et cetera, that the quality of life in those segregated communities declines over time too. So we go from kind of increasingly ghettoization to slumification over the mid part of the 20th century as well. So that's a typical story of America. It's a powerfully important one, and it helps us understand why how we're still struggling with urban inequality and the urban crisis today, and why that pattern persists throughout America today. But Milwaukee was particularly bad in this regard too. So by the time we get to the early civil rights era, Milwaukee has the highest concentration of Black people living in the inner city of any city in the country. 98% of Black people are stuck because of segregation and discrimination in what local people call the inner core. That's the highest concentration in the country. It also has the lowest percent of home ownership. So only 3% of African Americans in Milwaukee owned a home. That meant 97% rented. So that means a lot. That's a lot. That's how you build wealth during this time period. So if you don't own a home, it's hard for you to build wealth. It also was important in Milwaukee because you had to be what was a landowner to bring a formal claim against the police. And so police brutality was commonplace, but you couldn't bring a formal claim if you didn't own land. So if 97% of people are renting land and a disproportionate number of those people are facing problematic behavior from police, it severely limited their ability to get redress through any formal system there too. So segregation in Milwaukee was the worst in the country, or as bad as anywhere in the country, as a Birmingham or a Selma or a Montgomery, et cetera. So that extreme dynamic is really notable then, and sadly still today in Milwaukee as well.
Absolutely, and we had a question earlier regarding connections between this history and our current challenges with evictions and the work that Matthew Desmond highlighted, and we can see the direct connections in so many ways. I think we can also see some very direct connections regarding our current state of politics in Wisconsin, whether it's racial gerrymandering or if it's voter ID. All of that has its roots in the ways that the city's racial geographies played a role in sorting economics, politics, policing, and the like. We are mindful of the fact that we have about 2 minutes before the 1 o'clock hour. And Command Central is telling us that they're going to start wrapping us up whether we like it or not. So what we'd like to do, good doctors, is give you both an opportunity. If you can just take a second and share with us 2 or 3 parting thoughts about the history of Milwaukee's open housing marches. If you want to leave us with a couple of gems, what would those gems be? How would you leave us? What would you leave us with as it relates to this rich moment in Milwaukee and civil rights history?
Well, I think there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from the open housing marches in Milwaukee. I think one of the first lessons that we can learn is what it means to truly be committed to an issue. Today, so often there'll be outrage about some injustice. Then after a couple days or a couple weeks or so, the outrage will kind of go away. People forget about it and they move on to another issue to be outraged about. But the Youth Council stayed on this issue of open housing, and they marched for 200 consecutive days. So I think we can learn a lot from them about what it means to be dedicated, steadfast, and also resilient in the face of opposition, because they did face a lot of opposition. The second thing I think that we can learn from the open housing marches is the power of our youth, because essentially it was a youth-led movement. So I think if we're going to continue to try to transform our society into a better society, transform our city into a better city, we have to collaborate more with our young people in the same way that Vel Phillips did. We have to listen to our young people, because we really do need their insight and their energy. And I think one of the best ways that we can commemorate these marches is by doing exactly what you guys are doing, Adam and Robert, by going out there into the community, going out there into the schools, into the classrooms, and engaging our young people in this history, ensuring that they know this history, that they're able to draw inspiration from this history, and also that, you know, this history doesn't fall back into obscurity. Years from now, people are saying, I didn't know this happened in the same way that, you know, many of us did.
Let's find a way to go to Riverside together. The three of us.
Okay.
No, serious. I'm serious.
I would love to go back. I had a ball.
We'll go to Oakland
Two
Euros afterwards.
on lesson. One is, in a world of such division right now, I think the Milwaukee movement suggests the possibility of interracial struggle without sacrificing militancy. And that, you know, a lot of times we think to do that today requires things to be watered down, or, you know, so I think there's an interesting thing there we might think about too, and the possibilities of making connectivities between us across our lines of difference. But the other thing I think is just that's very powerful to me is that these Northern movement stories are critical to understanding the ongoing urban crisis today. And if we're really serious about confronting the issues in our communities today, that these stories help us understand how we got here and what led us here. And the long history of struggle, but also the long history and persistence of white supremacy and white resistance, not only in the most, you know, jaw-dropping forms that we see in this, but in the like everyday forms that city councils and mayor's offices and school boards and everyday people acted, whether it's moving to a different community, using their levers of power in the economy or in politics or in religious life, et cetera, to reaffirm and maintain and expand, sometimes very consciously, sometimes not so consciously, because these are the grooves that they've been acculturated to. But again, if we want to overcome those things, I think we really need to think deeply about them and understand how they've become reality and manifest over so long. And this history can really begin to open that up for us. It's also why we don't do it, because right. This requires a reckoning that most of us are not willing to have. So that's the answer why we don't tell Northern stories, because they're very hard in a way that the triumphalist Southern narrative is not.
Well, folks, we're going to wrap up our Facebook live stream. Good doctors, Erica Metcalfe, Patrick Jones, thank you so very much. If you can hold on, we are going to do some more Q&A backstage, if you will, as we start our live stream and have the participants, our attendees, pose a few more questions just for a few minutes, if you can sit tight. Thank you very much. Great job, Adam. Great job, Keisha and Command Central. Thank you, Kristen and Heather. We're going to stop our live stream now, and we're going to continue to chat just a little bit. So if you folks can hold on for a second, we'll get right into that. Thank you very much, folks.
So Rob's analogy for this is that this has been a game of pickup basketball, and now it becomes hustle. So we throw away the teams, and we just jump right in. You know, while we're doing that,
hold on one second.
Oh,
for the attendees, everybody, I'm going to try to unmute folks. So if you want to jump into the conversation, we'll see if we can get you in as well. This is sort of the conversation after the panel/lecture. So we've got questions about Ta-Nehisi Coates out here. Hey, Michelle, what's going on? Are you going to talk to us today? Michelle's been a regular attendee. We can't get her to say anything to us, though.
We do have John asked, if these will be saved and made available for future reference and research. So just so everyone knows that we are working on that currently. So there will be a database for this, and we will, essentially have this as an archive that we can go back. You can review any of the previous months. We will be continuing this all the way through August. Each month has a different theme. So we will have that available, as well as resource lists and bibliographies available as well too for each week that we do. So we will have that rolled out and make sure that everybody gets an announcement when that's up and ready.
I got to mute.
Yeah, everybody can talk now, but mute yourselves if you don't mind, if you don't have any immediate comments to share, but everybody's available. Thanks for that, Keisha. We're going to make sure this is all available, folks.
I just want to scroll through the images that we didn't get to. I'm drinking a sparkling water that matches this jet. We just have some images here real quick of Vel. This is her in the Common Council chambers. This is another image of her. I think that actually captures two very different levels of maybe exasperation on her part. Here's Vel partaking in the movement. I noticed Patrick changed his background to a great photo. Here's Vel, and this is kind of a triumphant photo that I also think is bittersweet. We always like to add
can you go back
that
to those
component to
first
it.
two images of Vel? Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things, Vel was the only African American and the only woman in the Common Council, and she faced resistance on both of those counts. And the men's club of City Hall was extremely powerful and dispiriting to her on many levels. So you see that here. She's battling through as the only African American and as the only woman, and she faced all kinds of kind of sexist, misogynistic stuff and assumptions in response to her. And then if you click up to her with the youth council members, so that was a draining part of it, her day-to-day with city council. And I think one of the things about what she loved, and she talked to me about this with the youth council, was, and she still throughout her whole life until she passed away, loved young people, and they were life-giving to her. And so I think the youth council and their energy and their dedication to what she was doing were really life-giving to her. And you can see it here with her singing and dancing and clapping with them, the just difference in her human and personal demeanor, and that she's drawing something from that is being sucked away in her work at the city council, and the burden that was as an everyday kind of thing that she was doing at City Hall.
Erica, do you want to add anything to this one?
Yeah, I mean, can you go to the one with Vel raised on the shoulders of the windows? Yeah, that one always stands out to me because it just reminds me of the alliance between the two, between Vel Phillips and the youth council. I also just see like a great deal of mutual love and respect between the two. I know the youth council really respected her and what she was doing in the Common Council and trying to get a fair housing ordinance passed and all the opposition she was going up against. I think they also had a great deal of respect for her when she was out there with them marching in the streets. She actually got arrested. She got death threats. And so I think they gained even more respect for her because she did that, and she didn't have to do that. And so they even made her an honorary commando. So they loved her. And then likewise, she had a great deal of respect and love for them as well. And I think she definitely got energy from them and also inspiration from them, especially for those days when, things looked very bleak.
Yeah.
Did you guys catch anything from her
documentary on Vel Phillips? Is there a biography or autobiography?
I heard that she had written an autobiography, written her own. I don't know whatever came of that. I would love to write about her.
She had worked on one when she had a position for a couple of years at Marquette towards the end of her life, and it has not come to fruition at this point. It's a phenomenal story. I mean, Vel's story goes well beyond on both ends of the civil rights era. So there's just a phenomenal book to be written about her. One of the funny things I became very close with Val. She was like a grandmother to me, and I lived right by her, so I became kind of her chauffeur. I drove her around because she, she doesn't drive and things like that. Many people have taken that honor at different moments in time, but so I drove her around a lot and things like that. And she, I'm losing my train of thought here, getting lost in what I was my reverie with her. Go back to where we were for a second here. What did you just said?
We were just asking about the biography. And
oh, yeah. So, I mean, one of the funny things about doing all these interviews with her is that what she wanted my book to be was the Vel Phillips biography. And one of the things I sweated about when the book came out was that it wasn't going to be that. It's a bigger history of the civil rights era. She's central to it. And thankfully, Harvard put this picture on the front of it because she was thrilled to have this picture on the front. But she always really wanted that book to be the Vel story of it, and which tells you a little bit about Mrs. Phillips. But it's just an incredible human being and lovely person. But I don't think, beyond the documentary, that there is any meaningful published.
And for those folks that are still with us, that documentary is titled Dream Big Dreams, and it streams on PBS's website here. Or I should know the actual web address by now, as many times as I've gone there, but it's available for folks to view.
I'll tell a story that's interesting about her too. We were talking, and she was a young lawyer, and she and her husband were part of the NAACP, and she was at an event with a very prominent judge. Her husband was out of town at a conference, and her mother, who practiced a kind of what we'd call now a respectability politic, was this kind of huge looming force in her life. And whenever you talk to Mrs. Phillips, that her mom was the voice in her head, her like conscience. And but her mom had always told her, if you ever get in a car with a man and he drives east towards the lake, make him stop immediately and get out. He's up to no good. So she went to this event, a formal event, as a lawyer, a young lawyer with her husband out of town, and she didn't drive, so she needed a ride home, and a white judge offered to give her a ride home. And on the way home, he started to go towards the lake. And she thought of her mom and what she had said and made him stop. And he tried to make the moves on her and thought, because she was a Black woman, that she was easy and that he could have access to her and her body. And she removed herself from that circumstance. But it underscores the, both the racial and the gendered dynamic of what she was dealing with at the time period, as well as her, despite her, Vel Phillips is this petite woman, and she was strong, very strong and assertive, and did not take guff from folks too. So I think that story is a really powerful one about the world she was trying to navigate at the time.
I'm going to do just a few more images here.
And attendees, jump in, interrupt. We're no longer formally presenting anything, so cut us off.
This is Michelle. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I was just going to jump in and add not just her gender and her race, but her age and the power dynamic too. Thank you so much for that story, though. Moms are right.
What's going on, Michelle?
I'm waiting for my students to call me because they needed tech help, but thankfully lunch must have gone a little longer, so I'm still here.
Okay.
When Vel was selected as one of the 5 most important political figures in the state's history during the sesquicentennial, they made a statue of her at the Historical Society, living in Madison at that time, and going back and forth and doing some oral histories with her. And I went to see it, and when I sat down at the coffee shop with her, I said, "Oh, Mrs. Phillips, what a great honor. I went and saw your statue." And in the statue, she's like poised, and she's holding some law books, and it's kind of like she's going to walk off the pedestal. And, you know, I complimented her about it, and she went, "Oh, Patrick, I am so glad my mother is not alive." And I was like, "What? What are you talking about? She would have been so proud of you." She said, "Oh, no, because a lady never stands or sits with her legs open." So her legs were like, you know, it was like she's striding off of the pedestal, you know, right? And so again, this just interesting story about this kind of moral politics and the loomingness of her mom in her head, and that middle class politic and culture that she was a part of, which is all the more impressive then that she is willing to leave that and come down into the street and protest with Father Grappi and the Youth Council and the Commando. She didn't have to do that. She had an out because of her class and her status.
I saw at UWM some of the mail that was sent to her, and there was one that, that was like, they didn't say anything about the open housing cause. They were like, "How dare you wear pants?" Seriously. They were like, "I saw you on the shoulders of those young men wearing pants." Like, that was what outraged them. So just a couple more images before I pull these down. I mean, these are really,
asked by the other women in the city government who had to wear dresses if she would wear pants to a city council meeting, because at the time that was not accepted. And she did, and there's an article in the paper about it, a minor, you know, it's kind of a minor article, but it was a big deal at the time, breaking a gendered barrier about that clothing thing. And she was always very proud of that moment. So that, you know, we think, you know, we kind of chuckle at some of those things now because they seem almost funny or laughable, but to the women in that working environment, those things were really, really big and meaningful. And she had the platform that her behavior could break some of those barriers.
Look at this photo. Yeah, this is
looking
something else. As we look at this photo, there's a question in the mix about school integration process in Milwaukee, and I'm just going to answer this for us and say we'd have to spend an entire month on that topic. There are several books that have addressed that question and the complicated nature of that question in really important ways. There's more than these three, but the ones that I point to, and please jump in, folks, More Than One Struggle, Jack Dougherty, obviously Lessons from the Heartland with Barbara Miner's work, and then Educating Milwaukee, a Golda Meir teacher, James Nelson. Those are the three that I would begin with. There are others, but to answer the question about the school desegregation or integration process in this city and region requires 4 separate discussions at the least, and we should probably end up doing like 60 different discussions about it. So,
there is
I don't mean to be dismissive. It's just really that complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some of Lloyd Barbie's collected writings were recently released as well. So, and then just to close up these images, this one, which Patrick has as his background, and then this telegram, which I believe is still on top of, like, on Peggy Broska's mantle, a telegram from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Milwaukee folks, and then these, which were these kind of incredible images. This one's more, this one is maybe more iconic than this one in Milwaukee, but I think this image is the sea of people on Wisconsin Avenue as far as you can see. And just to give you an idea of how much Grappi tends to eclipse everything, is like, I posted this photo on the anniversary of this march during the 50th anniversary, and there was a woman who's like, "I see Grappi," and it's like, okay, you do.
You know, when I first got hired at UWM, I came up to find housing as I was moving, and I was in the airport, and somehow or another struck up a conversation with a guy, and the first thing he said was, "Yeah, you got to learn about Father Grappi and the way that he led the civil rights movement in Milwaukee." Now, of course, as I was arriving, I had already begun to study the city's history and the movements. Mm-hmm. But that's this stranger. That was his contribution to my learning.
I was just going to say that this picture is from the march an estimated 20,000 people after King's assassination. And so Milwaukee was one of the places that, to its credit, did not break out in significant violence in the days after his death.
Hey, Wendy, these images are available in various ways through the UWM collection, but Adam can give you a link because he's pirated them in all kinds of illegal ways. And he has them all in one place, so you don't have to go search for them.
If it weren't for the pandemic, I'd be selling them on the corner of 27th and National right now. I'd be on Cesar Chavez Drive outside the Popeyes trying to get people buying chicken sandwiches, selling
Crazy Jim's Auto. Don't get started.
That's where I'd be.
Crazy Jim's Auto today.
Oh my
Selling laminated copies at Crazy Jim's.
All righty. Erica and Patrick, we thank you so very much. We don't want to keep you much longer. If there are any other pressing questions that folks want to pose before we wrap up, please do, but we want to respect their time and get them out of here.
I just wanted to say that the MLK telegram is really key, I think, in underscoring the importance nationally of the Milwaukee open housing campaign, in that King at that time is searching for a way to demonstrate that nonviolent direct action can be applied in the urban north, and it can be a militant tool for change. And the previous year, he largely failed in Chicago, and it's great soul searching, and Black power militancy is on the rise. And he sees and is acknowledging in that note that he sends to the movement in Milwaukee that they've done it, that they've found the way to apply nonviolent direct action in a militant way that's not overt violence on the one hand, and is not, as he calls it, supplication to white power on the other hand. And so Dr. King himself sees that critical importance, as did many other people at the time. And so, as important as Milwaukee is to the local history, I think it's again crucial to our national history in many ways, and it deserves its place in that national narrative that we tell ourselves and learn about in schools.
As we begin to wrap up, there is one question I think we can close with. Sarah is asking us to quickly explain what we mean by militant. I'm imagining in the context of the 1960s in particular. What do we mean by militant? When you all use that word, what are some explanations you can provide to help us understand what might be militant versus what might not be militant in the 1960s?
I think that's a complex question because there can be different degrees of militancy. I know when I was doing my research on the open housing movement, and I started learning more about the commandos and the community's reaction to the commandos, there were a lot of people in the city, Black and white, who were like, they thought that the commandos were just, too far, just too radical. And I mean, really what they were was just a security unit, the security unit of the youth council that, was their goal was just to protect marchers, but also to, embrace Black male leadership, as I said before. But when you compare them to other movements like, the Black Panther movement or, other more militant movements, they're really not that militant, when you think about it. So I just think that's a complex kind of question. There's different levels, you have to kind of compare it to other movements to determine militancy, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how to articulate that.
And I would just add too, I think that's exactly right. And that in the late 60s, there's a huge debate about how do we go forward. We've been struggling here in the civil rights era for over a decade, and even with historic pieces of legislation like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, not a lot has really changed, particularly in urban Black neighborhoods like those in Milwaukee or Cleveland or Chicago or New York. And so there's a lot of discussion about what's it going to take. What would it really take to be empowered in this society as Black people, to really be liberated, to really be equal, and the never-ending willingness of whites to resist, from small and structural and institutional ways to overt kinds of violence and most terribleness of white supremacy. growing numbers of people, and we see a parallel in the anti-war movement, et cetera.
Mhm.
Like, how do you really bring these systems and structures of oppression to heal and transform? And that there's a growing awareness it's going to take something more than what they're doing. So for some, it's an attitude and it's posturing. For some, it's, relinquishing their embrace of nonviolence and advocating armed self-defense or even revolutionary violence. For others, it's culture as the transformative force.
Sure.
There's lots of different ways, but that debate about what exactly it is really crucial, and different people answer it in different ways. Black capitalism is a way, lots of different ways, but there's a discussion and a debate. And I think we still have that today. Like,
We do.
people want transformative change. What will it take? What do we have to do? How do we define it? What are the techniques and strategies and tactics that would get us there? And there's a lot of rancor within progressive and liberal and left communities about how to do that, and different people have different ideas about it. So there's a lot of parallel there. But I think in general, it means a more uncompromising and aggressive challenge of this system.
Well, and I think some good examples of both of your points is, we often label SNCC as a more militant or radical departure from the Southern civil rights approach. And by that, we generally mean young people willing to go sit in an establishment and not move until they are served, which is very confrontational in 1959, 60, 61. It wasn't the first time that those kinds of expressions had occurred, but they are certainly a departure from what would be seen as the standard approach to either a boycott or a protest that doesn't engage an institution or people directly. And as you all mentioned, the physical representation of Black identity is in many respects considered militant. The willingness of Black communities, Black men, Black veterans, Black people, women included, to physically protect themselves against physical violence is considered militant in some ways, in many ways. We have to keep in mind that in the 1950s and the 1960s, the idea of Black equality, the idea that Black people could protect their own bodies, had at the very least 100 years of blatant denial as Jim Crow dominated not only the South, but the entire nation. So what we come to understand today as basic, really human rights of protecting oneself, that was considered something that could get you lynched up until the late 60s, early 70s, entire local movements were orchestrated around protecting Black women, for example. So the things that we attribute as being maybe more commonplace today could be considered significant departures from our standard understanding of Southern civil rights activism. And young people injected that radicalism into the movement in various ways. So folks, we thank you. I'm going to get these scholars out of here. They have a whole range of other things I'm sure they need to be doing. Patrick, Erica, thank you so very much. This has been awesome. Adam, Keisha, Kristen, Heather, appreciate you folks. We'll end our conversation now. We appreciate you folks.
I do think
Thank you so much.
one last thing, we did learn an answer to the Baja men's question of who let the dogs out during this question, and then this was Dr. Patrick Johns.
Patrick
Omaha,
did.
Nebraska.
A dog out.
A dog, yes.
That's the world we are
out.
in right now, right? All
Hey,
right,
everybody,
folks.
thank you so much for this event, for including me, and for everybody being here. It's really my pleasure.
Appreciate you.
Thanks all.
All right, Erica, take care now.
All right, take care, guys. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.